Hi, Eric Schoenfeld here with TechCrunch TV. It's been a big week for SOPA and PIPA, the legislation in Congress intended to fight overseas piracy, which saw a lot of protests online, and now both the House and the Senate have backed off of those bills. I have with me Mike Frickless, the General Counsel of Viacom, and David Sohn with the Center for Democracy and Technology in Washington, who we're going to talk about whether SOPA and PIPA should be killed or whether it should be fixed, and if so, how can it be fixed? So why don't we start with you, David? What do you feel were the biggest problems with SOPA and PIPA, and why did it? Why was there this huge reaction against it?
Sure. Well, look, I think the goals of this legislation are widely accepted, which is everybody acknowledges, yes, there's plenty of infringement going on online. That's a problem, and we need to look for ways to address it. The specific provisions, though, in these bills raise the prospect of collateral damage in a number of different ways to innovation and to free expression, and there are a range of different provisions in there that were problematic. And I think at this point, the House and the Senate have done the right thing by saying, look, we need to kind of do a hard reset here, go back and talk to the different stakeholders and see if we can't find something that's more consensus-based and that goes after the problem in a way that doesn't create all these risks of collateral damage.
And so, Mike, how do you feel? Do you feel that the legislation was flawed, or do you think that it should have passed as was?
Well, I will say that it obviously is true that there's not a giant consensus right now if you take the general public's point of view on this. I've never, in my experience, seen such a disinformation campaign and a disconnect between what's being said about the bill and what's actually in the bill. So there is going to be a reset now as an attempt to achieve re-achieve, I guess, a broad consensus, because there was one until quite recently.
What do you feel are the misconceptions?
Well, let's start out by saying, you know, the very first thing is you see it's been reduced to a soundbite that somehow SOPA equals censorship. And there's a number of things that are baked in there that are just simply incorrect. To begin with, people don't understand that copyright infringement itself is not an activity protected by the First Amendment. So people forget about the fact that copyright actually is the way that speech is funded in the United States. It was a fundamental principle actually reflected in the Constitution. It was actually, the first copyright bill was adopted by the first Congress before the First Amendment was adopted. And the fundamental principle that's baked in there is that having a free market-based system of funding speech is critically important in a democracy.
Let's take that, the censorship issue. What was the censorship argument, David? Can you explain to us why there were concerns about censorship?
Sure, and you know, I actually don't think it has anything to do with the idea that people think there's some First Amendment right to engage in infringement. That's not it at all. The concerns of those who are worried about the impact on lawful speech are worried not because we think that, you know, piracy needs to be protected, but because we think that a lot of the speech that happens online happens because third parties, ISPs, user-generated content websites, provide tools that users use. And if you start enacting measures that either create new litigation risks for those tools or that change the way they have to operate, that affects lawful speech as well. So I actually think it's really a straw man to say, gosh, people think there's a First Amendment right to infringe. No, the concern is that the internet has been set up in certain ways and online tools have been set up in certain ways that enable really robust free expression. And I think a lot of the concerns that you heard were concerns that we're starting to undermine that environment if we go down this path.
Yeah, so how can you say that there isn't a censorship issue? So in early versions of the bill, the way that these sites would be blocked would be through DNS blocking, right? So you'd block, if there was one piece of infringing content on a site, you could block the whole site, even though there might be non-infringing content. So
that's completely incorrect, though.
Okay.
That's completely incorrect. That is one of the pieces of misinformation that are out there. There's two bills that have different definitions. Under the House bill, the provision is if the site's engaged in conduct which under domestic law would allow seizing the site, then the site can be seized using these techniques under SOPA. So it's essentially applying the standard that already exists in the law to worldwide sites and saying that it has to meet that standard for seizure.
What is that standard?
That standard for seizure would, if you take a look at the sites that are being seized today, and actually
like Mega Upload?
Like Mega Upload. Before I get to that, let me mention the Protect IP Act, which actually had a test of its own for what was a site that was dedicated to infringing activities. A site that's dedicated to infringing activities is one that is principally engaged in, that is marketed for the purpose of engaging in piracy. Okay, that's the definition that's in the bill. So this stuff about one piece of content would allow you to take down a whole site is not true. What it would let you do is take down a site like Mega Upload, which, although like Grokster, you could find the Bible on Grokster. What the Supreme Court found was that the intent was expressed through emails, through teaching people about how to find pirated content, for marketing themselves to find pirated content. In the Mega Upload case, even posting copyrighted content to the site. When you find a site of that character, where the reason the site exists, that the principal purpose of the site is piracy, then in those cases there is a remedy which involves saying people shouldn't be able to access that site. It means you shouldn't be able to search for it. You shouldn't be able to spend money on it. The payment processor shouldn't do business with it. The ad network shouldn't be doing business with it. All the people who are participating in the ecosystem of a site which is principally engaged in piratical activities, that's what the remedy is for.
But even principally, I think that definition is also up for debate. Even Mega Upload, which obviously had a lot of pirated content, also had a lot of legitimate content. And now you have thousands and hundreds of thousands of people who had their legitimate files who they can't get access to. It's their own copyrighted material that they can't get access to because of this.
But it's kind of like,
and what you're saying is we should be able to do this more often.
Well,
right?
if you think, it's kind of like the website. It's kind of like the physical store that's engaged in fencing illegal activities in the back, but sells legitimate stuff up front. Right? It's the old toy store that was engaged in book running. What happens is when the site's activities clearly demonstrate that they intend to engage in piracy, then you need a remedy against that site. And the fact of the matter is that nobody who was doing business with Mega Upload didn't realize that this was a site that's principal activity was sharing copyrighted material. It was 4% of the traffic on the internet. And the reason that it was that was because it was filled with full-length motion pictures, full-length television shows, and these guys were doing everything they could to make sure that they were the place to go to find pirated material.
So let's go back to David. Let's bring in Mega Upload as an example, which was a big file sharing site that got shut down by law enforcement across several countries. Is that, and they're using current law to do that? Is that, to me that says that current law is sufficient for those cases, or is it not?
I think the other thing that you see in that case is you see cooperation by U.S. law enforcement authorities with foreign law enforcement authorities, right? They're going and arresting one of these principals in New Zealand. And look, cross-border issues on the internet are often going to require cross-border law enforcement cooperation. There's no way around that. And I think a big part of this going forward is just continued efforts to cooperate with foreign law enforcement authorities. When we find the real bad guys and they're based overseas, we're going to have to try to work with some of our overseas counterparts to go after them. That's going at the problem at the source, because when you do that, you find the real bad guy, you arrest them, you seize their servers. That really makes the bad stuff disappear from the internet. The problem with PIPA and SOPA is that instead of doing that, they tried to look to ways to use intermediaries, to try to get ISPs to block people from accessing it, to try to get search engines to censor their search results so that they wouldn't tell anyone where that is. Those tactics turn out to have a number of pernicious consequences, and they don't even work as well as advertised. And we can get into that more if you like, but our fear all along was that you're embracing these tactics which don't get at the problem at their source, don't really take this stuff off the internet, won't make it disappear, and yet start setting this precedent that's going to be used around the globe by other countries to balkanize the internet.